The screams echoed through the dusty thoroughfare of Yosemite, California, drawing curious onlookers to the spectacle that had arrived with the traveling show. Tessa Turner clutched the iron bars of her cage, her once beautiful dress now reduced to tattered rags that barely preserved her modesty. Her golden hair hung in dirty tangles around her gaunt face, and her blue eyes, once vibrant with life, now held only desperation and fear as the crowd gathered to gape at the wild woman of the frontier. It was the summer of 1876, and the small mining town had seen its share of oddities passing through, but never had they witnessed a human being displayed like a beast. The barker's voice rang out, spinning tales of a woman raised by wolves, discovered in the wilderness and now brought to civilization for their entertainment. Step right up. See the savage creature that walks like a woman but behaves like a beast. The barker, a rotund man with a waxed mustache and gaudy red coat, waved his cane dramatically. Only 50 cents to witness this marvel of nature. Mason Newell pulled his hat lower over his eyes as he observed the spectacle from across the street. At 30 years old, he'd seen plenty of cruelty in his life as a former Texas Ranger turned cattle rancher, but this display turned his stomach. There was nothing wild about the woman in the cage, only fear and hopelessness in her eyes. He'd recognized humanity when he first locked eyes with her from across the street, and in that moment, something inside him had shifted irrevocably. "Ain't right," muttered Thomas, Mason's ranch hand who stood beside him. "Treating a lady like that." "No," Mason agreed, his voice low as his hand instinctively drifted to the Colt revolver at his hip. "It ain't right at all." The barker continued his spiel, occasionally prodding at the cage with his cane when the woman didn't respond to his commands to growl or pace like the animal he claimed her to be. When the cane jabbed toward her a third time, Mason saw her shrink back, a flash of dignity mingled with terror crossing her face. "They feed her tonight?" Mason asked. Thomas shook his head. "Heard tell they ain't fed her since yesterday noon. Keeps her mean, they say." Mason's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough. "I'll meet you back at the ranch tomorrow. Got some business to attend to in town tonight." "What kind of business?" Thomas asked, though the knowing look in his weathered face suggested he already understood. "The kind that can't wait till morning," Mason replied, his eyes never leaving the cage where the woman now huddled in the corner, arms wrapped around herself for warmth despite the summer heat. As darkness fell over Yosemite, the crowd dispersed, and the traveling show performers retreated to the saloon, leaving only a single guard to watch over their wild woman attraction. Mason observed from the shadows, waiting for his moment. The guard was young, barely more than a boy, and clearly bored with his assignment. It wasn't long before the flask in his pocket became more interesting than his duties. Mason approached the cage silently, his boots making no sound on the packed dirt. The woman saw him before the guard did, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear and something else, a flicker of hope, perhaps. "Evening," Mason said, causing the young guard to startle and nearly drop his flask. "Show's closed, mister," the guard stammered, hastily tucking away the liquor. "Opens again at 10 tomorrow." Mason nodded toward the saloon. "Your boss in there wanted to talk business." The guard squinted suspiciously. "What kind of business?" "Private kind," Mason replied, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a handful of coins. "The kind worth a drink or two while I speak with him." Greed and the promise of alcohol loosened the guard's resolve. "I ain't supposed to leave my post." 5 minutes, Mason said, pressing the coins into the young man's hand. "I'll keep an eye on things here." The guard hesitated, then nodded, pocketing the money. 5 minutes, but if she makes any noise, you holler. She's unpredictable wild, you know." Mason tipped his hat. "I'll be careful." The moment the guard disappeared into the saloon, Mason turned to the cage. Up close, the woman's condition was even worse than he'd thought. Bruises marked her arms and her lips were cracked from dehydration. "Madam," he said softly, approaching the bars. "My name is Mason Newell. I aim to get you out of here. Can you understand me?" She stared at him, silent and unmoving. "I'm not with them," he continued, pulling out a small canteen and offering it through the bars. "Water. It's clean." Her eyes darted to the saloon doors, then back to him. Slowly, she reached for the canteen, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. She drank deeply, water spilling down her chin in her desperation to quench her thirst. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse but unmistakably refined, nothing like the growls and snarls the barker had claimed were her only sounds. "What's your name?" Mason asked, already working at the lock with a set of picks he'd brought. "Tessa," she answered. "Tessa Turner." "Well, Miss Turner, we don't have much time," he said as the lock clicked open. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though uncertainty crossed her face. "Where will we go?" "I've got a ranch about 3 hours' ride from here," Mason explained, swinging the cage door open. "You'll be safe there until we figure out what happened to you and where you belong." Tessa hesitated, clearly weighing her options: trust a stranger or remain captive. After only a moment's consideration, she stepped forward, wobbling slightly as her bare feet touched the ground outside the cage for the first time in what must have been weeks. "My horse is behind the mercantile," Mason said, shrugging out of his duster and wrapping it around her shoulders to conceal her tattered clothing. "We need to move quickly and quietly." As they slipped away from the cage, a shout erupted from the saloon doorway. The guard had returned early and he was now raising the alarm. "The wild woman! She's escaping!" Mason cursed under his breath, grabbing Tessa's hand. "Run!" They dashed through the alleyways of Yosemite, Tessa struggling to keep pace after weeks of confinement. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew: angry voices, boots on dirt, the promise of violence if they were caught. "I can't," Tessa gasped, stumbling on her weakened legs. "I can't run anymore." Without hesitation, Mason swept her into his arms. "Then I'll carry you." He ran with her cradled against his chest, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck as they made their way to where his Palomino stallion, Ranger, was tethered. Mason lifted Tessa onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. "Hold tight," he instructed, and she pressed back against him, her body tense with fear. Ranger bolted forward at Mason's command, hooves thundering on the hard-packed street as they galloped out of town. Behind them, several of the show's men had mounted their own horses, but Mason knew the terrain better than any visitor. He guided Ranger off the main road and into the trees, taking a winding path that only locals knew existed. The cool night air whipped past them as they rode, and Mason felt Tessa gradually relax against him, though her grip on his arm never loosened. They rode for nearly an hour before he was certain they weren't being followed anymore, but he didn't slow their pace. Every minute put more distance between Tessa and her captors. "Are you all right?" he asked when they finally slowed to give Ranger a rest. "Yes," Tessa answered, though her voice wavered. "Why did you help me? You don't know me." Mason considered the question as they continued at a gentler pace. "Some things a man just knows are wrong. Keeping a person in a cage is one of them." "They'll come looking for me," she warned. "The show makes good money from displaying me." "Let them come," Mason replied, his voice hardening. "My land, my rules. And I've got friends in these parts who don't take kindly to treating women like animals." The moon had risen high by the time they reached the boundary of Mason's property, illuminating the rolling pastures where his cattle grazed and the modest but sturdy ranch house that sat on a gentle rise. A small creek ran alongside the property, and several outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, a smokehouse completed the homestead. "Welcome to the North Star Ranch," Mason said as they approached the house. "It's not much, but it's peaceful." "It's beautiful," Tessa whispered, looking around with genuine appreciation. Mason helped her down from the horse, steadying her when her legs threatened to give out. Inside the house, he lit several lamps, illuminating a simple but comfortable living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and practical furniture filled the main room, a dining table, several chairs, shelves lined with books that surprised Tessa. "You can take my room tonight," Mason said, leading her toward a door off the main area. "I'll sleep out here." The bedroom was plainly furnished but clean, with a large bed covered in a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. "I'll heat some water for you to wash up," Mason offered, "and find you something to wear. Those clothes." Tessa looked down at her tattered dress and nodded gratefully. "Thank you for everything." While Mason busied himself heating water, Tessa sank onto the edge of the bed, her mind whirling with the dramatic change in her circumstances. Hours ago, she had been a captive, an object of spectacle and scorn. Now she was in a stranger's home, being treated with kindness she had almost forgotten existed. When Mason returned with a steaming pitcher of water and a clean shirt and pair of trousers that would be too large but serviceable, Tessa felt tears welling in her eyes. "I'll leave you to it," he said, setting the items down. "There's soap on the washstand. And I've put together some food when you're ready." "Mr. Newell," she called as he turned to leave. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Mason paused at the door. "Because someone wasn't kind to you when they should have been," he answered simply. "And that ain't right." After he left, Tessa approached the washstand with reverence, pouring the warm water into the basin. The simple act of washing away weeks of grime felt like rebirth. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink, then tackled her matted hair as best she could. The clothes Mason had provided, a soft flannel shirt, and cotton trousers, swallowed her frame but felt like the finest silk after the rags she'd been forced to wear. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Mason at the stove, stirring something that smelled so wonderful her stomach growled audibly. He turned at the sound, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Tessa knew she must still appear a fright despite her efforts to clean up, but there was no judgment in Mason's eyes, only concern and something gentler. "Stew's ready," he said, gesturing to the table where he'd set 2 bowls. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot." Tessa sat across from him, trying not to devour the food too quickly despite her hunger. The stew was simple but delicious: chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions in a rich broth. Mason had also set out fresh bread and butter, which tasted like heaven after weeks of stale crusts and scraps. "How long were you with them?" Mason asked after she'd eaten half her bowl. Tessa set down her spoon, memories dimming her appetite. 2 months, I think, the days. They all blended together after a while. "And before that," he prompted gently. Tessa stared into her bowl, debating how much to share with this stranger who had risked himself to save her. Finally, she decided that honesty was the least she owed him. "I was traveling west from Boston with my father," she began. "He was a professor of natural history coming to study the flora and fauna of California. We were attacked by bandits near Truckee. Her voice faltered. "They killed my father, took everything we had." Mason's expression darkened. "I'm sorry." "I wandered for days after burying him," Tessa continued. "I was trying to find my way to civilization when Mr. Blackwood and his traveling show found me. At first, I thought they were rescuing me. Then I realized what they intended." "Blackwood," Mason repeated, committing the name to memory. The man in the red coat, Tessa nodded, her hands trembling slightly at the memory. He said no one would believe me if I claimed to be a professor's daughter, that I looked wild enough to pass as his new attraction. When I refused to play along, She gestured vaguely to the bruises on her arms. "He won't touch you again," Mason promised, his voice low and intense. Tessa looked up, meeting his eyes. "You can't be sure of that. He'll come looking. He invested money in me, that's how he sees it." "Let him come," Mason repeated his earlier sentiment, but now there was steel in his voice. "This is my land, my home, and you're under my protection now." The conviction in his voice warmed something inside Tessa that had grown cold during her captivity. She didn't know this man, this cowboy who had broken her out of a cage and brought her to his home, but somehow she believed him. "Now," Mason said, his tone softening, "you should get some rest. Tomorrow we can figure out what you want to do next." "What I want to do?" Tessa repeated, confusion evident in her voice. "Yes, madam," Mason nodded. "Your life is your own again. Whatever you decide, I'll help you get there." For the first time in months, Tessa felt the stirring of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Newell." "Mason," he corrected with a small smile. "After tonight, I reckon we're past formalities." Tessa returned his smile hesitantly. "Then thank you, Mason." That night, as Tessa lay in Mason's bed, wrapped in clean sheets that smelled of sunshine, she wept not from fear or despair as she had so many nights in the cage, but from relief and gratitude. Outside the bedroom door, Mason sat in a chair, his Colt revolver across his lap, keeping watch until dawn broke over the North Star Ranch. The morning sun streamed through the small window, waking Tessa from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. For a disorienting moment, she expected to see iron bars surrounding her, but instead found herself in the simple bedroom of Mason's ranch house. The relief that flooded through her was so intense it brought fresh tears to her eyes. She rose and found that Mason had left fresh water in the pitcher on the washstand. After washing her face, she made an attempt to tame her hair, using her fingers to work through the tangles that the previous night's hasty washing hadn't resolved. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found the main room empty, but the front door was open, letting in the morning breeze. On the table sat a plate of biscuits covered with a cloth, a pot of what smelled like coffee, and a note written in a firm hand. "Gone to check cattle. Help yourself to breakfast. Back soon." Tessa poured herself a cup of coffee, savoring the rich aroma before taking a cautious sip. It was strong but good, and the warmth spread through her body pleasantly. She took a biscuit from the plate and stepped out onto the porch, wanting to see the ranch in daylight. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched in every direction, dotted with oak trees and grazing cattle. To the west, mountains rose majestically against the clear blue sky. The air was fresh and sweet, carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers. Movement caught her eye, a rider approaching from the distant pasture. Even from a distance, she recognized Mason's straight-backed posture in the saddle. He rode confidently, at ease on his horse in a way that spoke of years of experience. As he drew nearer, Tessa felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. In the morning light, she could better appreciate his appearance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He spotted her on the porch and raised a hand in greeting before guiding his horse to the small stable beside the house. Tessa watched as he dismounted fluidly and removed the saddle, speaking softly to the animal as he worked. "Good morning," he called as he approached the porch. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in a very long time," Tessa admitted. "Thank you for the breakfast." Mason climbed the porch steps, removing his hat as he did so. "It's nothing fancy. I'm not much of a cook." "It's perfect," Tessa assured him, suddenly conscious of her appearance in his oversized clothes, her hair a mess despite her efforts to tame it. Mason seemed to read her thoughts. "I've been thinking," he said. "There's a widow in town, Mrs. Larson. She runs a boarding house and does some seamstress work. I could ride into town and ask her to bring some clothes for you." "That would be wonderful," Tessa said gratefully. "But won't she ask questions?" "Mrs. Larson's not one for gossip," Mason assured her, "and she's got a good heart. She helped a few women in trouble before." Tessa hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind since waking. "What about Mr. Blackwood and his men? Won't they still be in town?" Mason's expression hardened. "They might be, but that doesn't change what needs doing. You need proper clothes, and Mrs. Larson can help with that." His voice softened. "Don't worry, I'll be careful." "I don't want you risking yourself for me again," Tessa protested. "You've already done so much." "Miss Turner," Mason said, his voice gentle but firm. "In case you haven't noticed, I make my own decisions about what risks are worth taking." There was something in the way he looked at her, then a warmth and determination that made Tessa feel both safe and unsettled in the most curious way. She nodded, unable to find words to argue against his resolve. "While I'm gone," Mason continued, "you should stay inside or close to the house. Thomas, my ranch hand, will be around, but he'll keep his distance unless you need something. He knows you're here and why. Does he know?" "What I was to them?" Tessa asked, ashamed despite knowing she had nothing to be ashamed of. "He knows you were being held against your will," Mason answered carefully. "The details don't matter to him, just like they don't matter to me. What matters is that you're safe now." The simple acceptance in his words eased something tight in Tessa's chest. "Thank you." After Mason had eaten a quick breakfast, he prepared to ride back to town. Before leaving, he showed Tessa where he kept a shotgun behind the door and made sure she knew how to use it just in case. "I don't expect trouble," he assured her, "but better you know how to protect yourself." As she watched him ride away, Tessa felt a strange mixture of anxiety and peace. Anxiety that she might bring danger to this man, who had shown her such kindness, and peace that, for the first time in months, she was being treated as a person with dignity and worth. She spent the morning exploring the house, finding comfort in the simple, practical space that reflected its owner's character. The bookshelves surprised her, most volumes of poetry alongside practical guides to ranching, novels by Dickens and Twain, histories of the West. Her father would have approved of such a varied collection. The thought of her father brought a fresh wave of grief. In the cage, she had suppressed her memories, focusing only on survival. Now, in this safe place, the full weight of her loss threatened to overwhelm her. She sank into a chair, pressing her hands to her face as tears came. "Miss," the tentative voice startled her. Tessa looked up to find a weathered man standing at the open door, hat in hand. He was older than Mason, with graying hair and a lined face that spoke of years under the sun. "I'm Thomas," he introduced himself. "Mason's foreman. Didn't mean to disturb you, but I brought some eggs from the henhouse. Thought you might want them for lunch." Tessa hastily wiped her tears, embarrassed to be caught crying. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. That's very kind." "Just Thomas, miss," he corrected with a gentle smile. "And it's no trouble. Mason told me what happened to you. Mighty brave of you to survive what you did." His simple acknowledgement of her ordeal without pity or judgment brought fresh tears to Tessa's eyes. "I don't feel very brave," she admitted. Thomas placed the basket of eggs on the table. "Well, sometimes bravery is just getting through each day when days are hard." He tipped his hat. "I'll be in the north pasture if you need anything. Just ring the bell on the porch." After Thomas left, Tessa found herself drawn to Mason's books. She selected a volume of Wordsworth's poetry and carried it to the porch, where she sat in a rocking chair, reading verses that transported her far from her recent troubles. The familiar words were a balm to her soul, reminding her of quiet evenings in her father's study in Boston. Hours passed peacefully, broken only by the distant sounds of cattle and the gentle creaking of the rocking chair. It was mid-afternoon when Tessa heard hoofbeats approaching. She tensed, reaching for the shotgun Mason had shown her, but relaxed when she recognized Mason riding alongside a wagon driven by a plump, gray-haired woman. "Miss Turner," Mason called as they approached. "This is Mrs. Larson. She's brought some things for you." The widow Larson proved to be exactly as Mason had described, kind-hearted and discreet. She greeted Tessa warmly, her eyes taking in Tessa's appearance without judgment. "Mr. Newell told me you'd need some essentials," she said, climbing down from her wagon with Mason's assistance. "I've brought several dresses that should fit with minor adjustments, undergarments, stockings, and some toiletries a lady might need." Tessa was overwhelmed by the woman's generosity. "I can't possibly repay you for all this," she protested. Mrs. Larson waved away her concerns. "Mr. Newell has taken care of everything. And between us, dear, helping someone in need is payment enough for me." Inside, Mrs. Larson helped Tessa try on the dresses she'd brought, simple, practical garments, but clean and well-made. One in particular, a blue calico with small white flowers, seemed made for her. "That color suits you," Mrs. Larson observed, pinning the waist to fit Tessa's slender frame. "Brings out the blue in your eyes." While they worked, Mrs. Larson chatted about the town, filling Tessa in on the local gossip without asking intrusive questions about Tessa's own situation. It was a kindness that Tessa deeply appreciated. "Those show people are still in town," Mrs. Larson mentioned casually as she worked, causing quite a stir with their missing attraction. "The sheriff isn't particularly interested in helping them, mind you. Sheriff Williams has never had much patience for those traveling shows." Tessa's hand stilled in her lap. "Are they searching for me, Mrs.?" Larson nodded, her expression serious. "They are. That's why Mr. Newell asked me to be discreet about coming here. But don't you worry, half the town thinks their wild woman was just a local girl they paid to act the part, and the other half doesn't care one way or another." "And what do you think, Mrs. Larson?" Tessa asked quietly. The older woman's eyes were kind but shrewd. "I think a young lady like yourself deserves better than to be gawked at in a cage, whatever your circumstances might be." She tied off her thread and snipped it. "There. This one's ready to wear. Why don't you change into it while I speak with Mr. Newell about when to return for the final fittings?" When Tessa emerged from the bedroom in her new dress, she found Mason and Mrs. Larson deep in conversation on the porch. They both turned as she approached, and Tessa didn't miss the way Mason's expression changed when he saw her, a momentary widening of his eyes, a softening around his mouth. "Well now," Mrs. Larson said with satisfaction, "that's more like it. You look like yourself again, dear." Tessa smoothed her hands over the fabric, feeling human again in proper clothing. "I can't thank you enough, Mrs. Larson." "You can thank me by taking good care of yourself," the widow replied, "and perhaps by coming to visit me in town when it's safe." I don't get many opportunities for genteel conversation these days. After Mrs. Larson had departed with promises to return in a few days to finish altering the other dresses, Mason and Tessa stood on the porch watching the wagon disappear down the road. "You look," Mason began, then seemed to search for the right words. "More yourself," he finally said, echoing Mrs. Larson. "I feel more myself," Tessa admitted, "though I'm not entirely sure who that is anymore." Mason considered her words thoughtfully. I reckon that's something you'll discover day by day. No rush. His simple understanding touched her deeply. Did you learn anything in town about Mr. Blackwood's plans? Mason's expression darkened. They're staying through the week, supposedly for the scheduled performances, but I suspect they're hoping to find you. Blackwood's offering a reward for information. Tessa wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm afternoon. I'm putting you in danger by staying here. I've been in worse danger for lesser causes, Mason replied, his voice steady. And this ranch is remote enough that they're unlikely to come this way without reason. But if they do, Mason's hand drifted to his gun belt in an unconscious gesture. Then they'll learn that North Star Ranch isn't a place where people are treated like property. The conviction in his voice should have frightened Tessa, the promise of potential violence, but instead, she found it reassuring. Not because she wanted bloodshed, but because for the first time since her father's death, someone was willing to stand between her and harm. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Tessa realized she had spent the entire day without fear, a gift she hadn't thought possible just 24 hours earlier. She turned to find Mason watching her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the sunset. "Yes," Tessa agreed, though she wasn't only thinking of the sky. "Thank you, Mason, for everything." He shook his head slightly. "No need to keep thanking me, having you here." He paused, seeming surprised by what he'd been about to say. "Well, it's good to have company on the ranch. Gets lonely sometimes." There was something in his voice, a vulnerability that matched her own, that made Tessa's heart beat faster. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to forge a connection that went beyond rescuer and rescued. But before she could move, the moment was broken by Thomas calling from near the barn, alerting Mason to an issue with one of the horses. "Duty calls," Mason said with a small smile. "I'll be back to start supper soon." As he walked away, Tessa remained on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky and wondering at the strange new feelings stirring within her, feelings of safety, yes, but also something warmer and more complicated that she wasn't yet ready to name. The days that followed settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Each morning, Tessa would wake to find Mason already out checking the cattle. She would prepare breakfast, enjoying the simple domestic task after so long being treated as less than human. When Mason returned, they would eat together, their conversations growing easier and more natural each day. During the day, while Mason worked the ranch with Thomas and the other hands, Tessa found ways to make herself useful. She cleaned the house, which clearly hadn't seen a woman's touch in years. She discovered a small vegetable garden that had been neglected and set about reviving it, weeding and tending the struggling plants. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch or by the fireplace if the night was cool, talking or simply enjoying a comfortable silence. Mason told her about his years as a Texas Ranger, how he'd saved to buy this ranch, his dreams of expanding it someday. Tessa shared stories of Boston, her father's academic pursuits, the books they both loved. Neither of them mentioned the future or how long Tessa might stay. It was as if by tacit agreement they were allowing themselves this peaceful interlude without complicating it with what came next. Mrs. Larson visited twice more, bringing the altered dresses and news from town. The traveling show had moved on, she reported during her second visit, a week after Tessa's escape. "Left yesterday morning," the widow said as she helped Tessa fold the newly altered clothes. Though that Blackwood fellow was asking questions right up until they departed, seemed mighty upset about losing his wild woman. Relief washed over Tessa, though she knew it might be premature. "Did he say where they were headed?" "Sacramento," according to the posters they left behind, Mrs. Larson replied. But between us, I wouldn't consider yourself entirely safe yet. A man like that who'd keep a woman in a cage, he's not likely to simply forget about you. The warning lingered in Tessa's mind after Mrs. Larson departed. That evening, as she and Mason sat on the porch watching the fireflies begin to rise from the grass, she broached the subject that had been weighing on her. "I should leave," she said quietly. "Now that Blackwood has moved on from Yosemite, I should find my own way." Mason turned to her, surprise evident in his features. "Where would you go?" It was a fair question, and one Tessa had been struggling with. "I'm not sure. Perhaps San Francisco. I could find work as a teacher, perhaps. My father ensured I was well educated." "Is that what you want?" Mason asked, his voice carefully neutral. Tessa looked out over the ranch, the land that had become a sanctuary to her, the home where she had begun to heal. "No," she admitted softly, "but I can't impose on your kindness forever." "It's not an imposition," Mason said firmly, "having you here." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "The ranch feels more like a home with you in it." The simple statement held so much meaning that Tessa found herself momentarily speechless. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "I've felt the same way." Mason shifted in his chair, facing her more directly. In the gathering dusk, his features were softened, but his eyes were intent on hers. "Stay, Tessa, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to be here, with me." The invitation hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken feelings that had been growing since that first night. Tessa's heart raced as she recognized the moment for what it was: not just an offer of continued sanctuary, but the possibility of something deeper. "I want to," she answered honestly, "but I'm afraid." "Of Blackwood coming back?" Mason asked. "Partly," Tessa acknowledged, "but also of caring for someone again, of losing someone again like I lost my father." Mason reached across the space between their chairs, his hand finding hers. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid against her skin. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen, but I can promise that as long as I'm breathing, you'll never be alone again. Not unless you choose to be." Tessa looked down at their joined hands, then back up to Mason's face. In his expression, she saw everything she was feeling reflected back at her: uncertainty, hope, and a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I'll stay," she said finally, "for as long as you want me here." Mason's smile in response was like the sunrise, gradual then brilliant. "That might be a very long time, Miss Turner." "I hope so, Mr. Newell," she replied, returning his smile with one of her own. That night marked a shift in their relationship. Nothing dramatic, no declarations of love or passionate embraces, but a quiet acknowledgement that what was growing between them was worth nurturing. Mason began teaching Tessa about ranch life, showing her how to ride the gentle mare he kept for visitors, explaining the rhythms of the cattle and the land. Tessa, in turn, brought her own skills to their partnership. She planted herbs near the kitchen door, started keeping the ranch's accounts in order with her neat handwriting, and read aloud from Mason's books in the evenings, her clear voice bringing the words to life in a way that made even Thomas and the other hands stop to listen when they passed by the open windows. 2 weeks after Tessa had decided to stay, Mason received word that he needed to ride to a neighboring ranch to help with a cattle drive. It would mean 3 days away, the longest they had been apart since her rescue. "I don't have to go," Mason said as they discussed it over breakfast. "Thomas could handle it." "Don't be silly," Tessa replied, though the thought of being alone made her nervous. "The Hendersons need your help, and I'll be perfectly fine here. Thomas and the others will be nearby." Mason still looked uncertain. Blackwood and his show should be well on their way to Sacramento by now, but still. I know how to use the shotgun, Tessa reminded him with a small smile, and I promise to stay close to the house. Go. Do what needs doing. The morning of Mason's departure dawned clear and cool. He lingered at breakfast longer than necessary, going over instructions with Tessa one final time. Thomas will check on you morning and night, he said, strapping on his gun belt. And Mrs. Larson said she might ride out tomorrow if the weather holds. I'll be fine, Tessa assured him, though her own apprehension had grown as the moment of his departure approached. At the door, Mason turned to her, hesitating as if there was something more he wanted to say. Instead, he simply touched her cheek gently, his fingers calloused but tender against her skin. 3 days, he promised. I'll be back before you know it. Tessa watched him ride away, staying on the porch until he was just a speck in the distance. The ranch felt oddly empty without his presence, despite Thomas and the other hands going about their usual work nearby. She kept herself busy that first day, cleaning and baking bread, tending to her garden and reading. Thomas checked in at midday and again at sunset, reporting that all was well and asking if she needed anything. That night, alone in the house, Tessa found it hard to sleep. Every creak of the settling house, every rustle of wind in the trees outside made her start. Eventually, she moved to the main room, wrapping herself in a blanket on the sofa near the fireplace, finding comfort in the dying embers' warm glow. The second day passed much like the first, with Tessa keeping herself occupied with domestic tasks. Mrs. Larson arrived mid-afternoon with fabric for curtains, and the two women spent a pleasant few hours sewing and chatting. "You're good for him, you know," Mrs. Larson said as they worked. "Mason. I've known him since he came to these parts 5 years ago. Never seen him as content as he's been these past weeks." Tessa felt a blush warm her cheeks. "He saved my life. I owe him everything." Mrs. Larson gave her a knowing look. "That may be how it started, dear, but it's not where it's ending. Anyone with eyes can see you two are falling in love." Love. The word hung in the air, both frightening and exhilarating. Tessa had been too focused on recovery and safety to examine her feelings too closely, but she couldn't deny the truth in the widow's observation. "Is it that obvious?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Larson chuckled. "Only to everyone who sees you together." Her expression softened. "It's a beautiful thing to witness, especially knowing what you've been through." After Mrs. Larson left, promising to return the following week to help with more sewing projects, Tessa found herself restless. The conversation about her feelings for Mason had unsettled her, making his absence more acute. She decided to walk to the small stream that ran along the eastern edge of the property, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear her mind. The late afternoon sun was warm on her face as she followed the well-worn path, drinking in the beauty of the land that was becoming so dear to her. The stream was peaceful, its gentle gurgling soothing her nerves as she sat on a large rock at the water's edge. She removed her shoes, dipping her feet into the cool water and closing her eyes to savor the sensation. That was when she heard a twig snapping somewhere behind her, too heavy to be a small animal. Tessa's eyes flew open, her heart suddenly pounding as she turned toward the sound. "Well, well," said a familiar voice that sent ice through her veins. "If it isn't my wild woman, looking quite civilized now." Reginald Blackwood stood at the edge of the clearing, his red coat as garish as she remembered, his waxed mustache twisted in a cruel smile. Behind him, 2 of his men from the show waited, their expressions equally unpleasant. Tessa scrambled to her feet, backing away until the stream prevented further retreat. "How did you find me?" "Small towns breed loose tongues, my dear," Blackwood replied, advancing slowly. "Particularly when there's money to be exchanged. A young woman appearing suddenly at a remote ranch. People notice such things. Tessa glanced toward the path back to the house. It was too far, she'd never outrun them. "What do you want?" Blackwood's smile widened. "You know exactly what I want. You're my property, girl, my investment, and I've come to reclaim what's mine." "I'm not yours," Tessa said, surprised at the steadiness in her voice despite her terror. "I never was." "Such spirit," Blackwood chuckled. "The audiences love that. Makes for a better show when the wild woman fights her cage." He gestured to his men. "Take her, and be careful she bites." As the men approached, Tessa looked desperately for an escape route. The stream behind her was too shallow to swim, but perhaps if she ran along its edge. Before she could move, a gunshot cracked through the air, sending birds scattering from the trees. Blackwood and his men froze, turning toward the source of the sound. Thomas stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle raised. "The lady isn't going anywhere with you," he said, his weathered face hard with anger. "This doesn't concern you, old man," Blackwood sneered. "This woman is my property. She escaped from my show." "No human being is property on North Star Ranch," Thomas replied, his rifle unwavering. "Now, you and your men are going to turn around and leave, or I'll put a bullet in each of you." Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "3 of us, one of you. Poor odds, wouldn't you say?" "I only need to hit you first," Thomas said calmly. "And I rarely miss." The standoff stretched for a tense moment, with Tessa hardly daring to breathe. Then Blackwood's hand moved toward his coat, where Tessa knew he kept a small derringer. Another shot rang out, not from Thomas this time, but from further up the path. One of Blackwood's men cried out, clutching his arm as blood seeped between his fingers. "Next one won't be a warning," called a new voice, one that made Tessa's heart leap with relief. Mason appeared from the trees, his Colt revolver aimed steadily at Blackwood. "Thomas is right. The lady stays, you go. Those are the only options that don't end with you in a pine box." Blackwood's face paled as he realized he was outmatched. "This isn't over," he snarled. "She's mine by right. I found her." "She belongs to herself," Mason replied, his voice deadly quiet. "And she's under my protection now. If you ever come near her again, I'll kill you without hesitation. That's a promise." Something in Mason's tone, the absolute certainty of his threat, finally seemed to penetrate Blackwood's arrogance. He backed away slowly, gesturing for his men to do the same. "You haven't heard the last from me," he warned, but the threat sounded hollow now. "Actually, I believe we have," Mason countered. "Because if I see your face again, you won't live long enough to speak." He nodded toward the injured man. "Take your friend and go. Don't stop until you're well beyond Yosemite." Tessa watched, trembling with relief and residual fear, as Blackwood and his men retreated into the trees. Mason kept his gun trained on them until they were out of sight, then rushed to Tessa's side. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "No," she assured him, her voice shaking. "You came back early. Finished sooner than expected," he explained, holstering his weapon and taking her hands in his. "Thank God I did." Thomas approached, lowering his rifle. "I was checking the eastern fence line when I heard voices. Saw them corner Miss Tessa here." "You saved my life," Tessa told the old ranch hand gratefully. "Both of you." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what needed doing. I'll make sure they leave the property," he added to Mason. "You get Miss Tessa back to the house." As Thomas followed Blackwood's trail, Mason wrapped an arm around Tessa's shoulders, steadying her as they walked back toward the ranch house. She was still trembling, the shock of Blackwood's appearance and the near miss making her legs weak. "I'm sorry," Mason said as they walked. "I should have been here. I should have known he might come looking." "You couldn't have known," Tessa replied, leaning into his strength. And you came back just in time. At the house, Mason insisted on checking every room before he allowed himself to relax slightly. He built up the fire while Tessa sat wrapped in a blanket, still shaken by the encounter. "He found me so easily," she said quietly. "What if he comes back with more men?" Mason knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "He won't. Men like Blackwood are cowards at heart. Once they know they're facing real opposition, they find easier targets." He squeezed her hands gently. "But if it would make you feel safer, I can ride to town tomorrow and speak with Sheriff Williams. Make sure Blackwood understands there will be legal consequences if he returns." Tessa nodded, drawing comfort from the solid warmth of his hands around hers. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Not just of being taken again, but of never seeing you again." The words hung between them, more revealing than she had intended. Mason's expression softened, his eyes dark with emotion as they held hers. "Tessa," he began, his voice rough with feeling, "when I saw Blackwood threatening you, I realized something. I realized that losing you would be like losing the sun. These past weeks with you here, they've changed everything. Changed me." Tessa's breath caught at the raw honesty in his words. "Mason, I know it's too soon," he continued. "You've been through so much and you're still healing. But I need you to know that whatever happens, wherever life takes you, my heart goes with you now." Tears welled in Tessa's eyes, not from fear this time, but from a joy so intense it was almost painful. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "Not when every day with you feels like coming home." Mason reached up, his calloused fingers gentle as they brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward until his lips met hers in a kiss that was both tender and reverent, a promise and a question all at once. Tessa answered by sliding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened. In that moment, the fear of Blackwood, the trauma of her captivity, the uncertainty of the future all receded, leaving only the certainty that wherever Mason was, she had found her place in the world. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Tessa Turner," he said simply. "I think I have since the moment I saw you looking out from that cage with more dignity than anyone had a right to have after what you'd endured." "I love you too," Tessa replied, the words feeling like the most natural truth she had ever spoken. "And I'm not afraid any more, not of Blackwood, not of the future, not as long as we face it together." Mason's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Together," he agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. The following day, Mason rode to Yosemite to speak with Sheriff Williams. He returned with news that eased Tessa's remaining fears. Blackwood and his traveling show had been escorted to the county line and warned never to return to the area. The sheriff, outraged at the story of Tessa's captivity, had promised to send word to other lawmen along Blackwood's likely route, ensuring that the showman would find himself unwelcome in reputable towns throughout California. Life at North Star Ranch settled into a new rhythm after that one built on the foundation of love that had been declared, but had been growing since those first days after Tessa's rescue. Mason and Tessa spent their days working side by side, building a life together that neither had imagined possible just months before. As summer turned to fall, Mason spoke of making their arrangement more permanent. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in magnificent hues of orange and purple, he took her hand in his. "I've been thinking," he began, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice, "about the future, our future." Tessa smiled, her heart quickening at his tone. "What about it?" Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Opening it, He revealed a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. "This was my mother's," he explained. "She gave it to me before she died, said to save it for the woman who made my house a home." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tessa Turner, will you marry me?" Tears of joy sprang to Tessa's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch with Mrs. Larson, Thomas, and the other ranch hands as witnesses. The local minister performed the service on the porch where they had spent so many evenings getting to know each other. Tessa wore a new dress of ivory satin that Mrs. Larson had helped her make, with wildflowers from the ranch lands woven into her hair. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days, Tessa marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the lowest point of degradation in that cage to the highest joy in Mason's arms, it seemed almost too miraculous to be real. But it was real as the solid band of gold now encircling her finger, as real as Mason's hand holding hers, as real as the land stretching out around them that they would work together for the rest of their lives. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other fully for the first time. Mason's touch was gentle yet passionate, awakening feelings in Tessa that she had never imagined possible. In his arms, the last shadows of her captivity melted away, replaced by a love so profound it seemed to transcend the physical world. "I never thought I could be this happy," Tessa confessed as they lay together afterward, her head resting on Mason's chest, his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear. "Nor I," Mason replied, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "When I found you in that cage, I was just trying to right a wrong. I never expected to find my heart's home." Tessa raised herself up on one elbow to look into his face. "You believe in fate, Mason, that some things are meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem?" Mason considered the question thoughtfully. "I don't know about fate," he answered honestly, "but I do believe that sometimes out of the darkest moments come the brightest blessings. And you, Tessa Newell, are the brightest blessing of my life." The name, her new name, sent a thrill through Tessa. She was no longer defined by her captivity or by the tragedy of her father's death. She was Tessa Newell now, rancher's wife, partner, beloved. The days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months. North Star Ranch prospered under their joint care. Mason's cattle business expanded, and with Tessa's careful accounting and planning, they were able to purchase adjacent land when it became available, nearly doubling the size of their holdings. Tessa started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, teaching 3 days a week in a room they added to the main house. Her students adored her, and Mason would often pause in his work to watch her through the window, her face animated as she shared her knowledge with the eager young minds. They never heard from Blackwood again. Occasionally, travelers passing through would bring news of the traveling show, which had fallen on hard times after losing its star attraction. Eventually, word came that Blackwood had died in a bar fight in some frontier town, his grand schemes and cruel ambitions ending in a pool of blood on a saloon floor. Tessa felt no joy at the news, but a sense of closure that allowed her to finally put that chapter of her life completely behind her. In the spring of their 2nd year of marriage, Tessa discovered she was expecting a child. When she shared the news with Mason, his joy was so profound that he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, then immediately set her down again, apologizing profusely for his exuberance. "Are you happy?" he asked, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "Truly happy with this life we've built," Tessa covered his hands with her own. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she assured him. Sometimes I still wake up expecting to see the bars of that cage around me. Instead, I find you and this home and now this new life growing inside me." She blinked back tears of joy. "It feels like a miracle, Mason, all of it." Mason pulled her close, his embrace gentle but secure, just as he had been since the night he'd broken her out of that cage and changed both their lives forever. "Not a miracle," he murmured against her hair. "Just love, the kind that heals, that builds, that endures." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "The kind that sets us free." Tessa thought of the cage that had once held her, not just the physical one from which Mason had rescued her, but the invisible ones of fear and despair that had threatened to trap her spirit. Love had indeed been the key that unlocked them all. Their son, James Thomas Newell, was born on a crisp autumn day, with Mrs. Larson serving as midwife. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, and from his first cry, he filled their home with a joy neither had thought possible. As Tessa nursed her son beside the fire that evening, Mason sitting beside them with wonder still evident on his face, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this perfect moment. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Tessa smiled down at their sleeping child, then up at the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best if we're brave enough to keep going, to keep believing that something better awaits." Mason leaned forward to press a kiss to her forehead, then to the downy head of their son. "I'm thinking," he replied, "that I'm the luckiest man in California to have found you, cage and all." "No," Tessa corrected gently. "We found each other, and in finding each other we both found freedom." As night fell over North Star Ranch, the little family remained by the fire, bound together by a love that had begun with an act of courage and compassion in the face of cruelty. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, brilliant against the darkening sky, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, light finds a way to shine through. For Tessa and Mason Newell, that light would continue to guide them through all the years to come, through the birth of 2 more children, through droughts and prosperous years, through joys and sorrows, shared equally between 2 hearts that had recognized in each other not just salvation, but home. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch where they had first acknowledged their love, they would look at each other and see not just the people they had become, but the ones they had been: a broken woman in a cage, a lonely rancher with a fierce sense of justice, and marvel at how far they had come together. In those moments, they needed no words. The touch of hand to hand, heart to heart, was enough, a silent affirmation that love, true love, could transform even the darkest cage into the most beautiful freedom.